Good morning, everyone. It's Tuesday, the day after Victoria Day, and we're at principle number 4 in Principles for Building Resilience, chapter 6. Uh, I want to have a little bit of fun with this chapter, if possible. I think we've seen it before, most of this, the idea of fostering complex adaptive systems thinking should not strike us as a novel idea. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe with Professor Lepore, you would have encountered this notion, the notion of a CAS. Now, the thesis of this book is that ecological systems, SESs, are complex, should be seen as complex adaptive systems. Now, when I say should be seen, I'm stepping beyond the text. The text, in fact, says that they can be seen. That's a pretty weak claim, in my view. You can see anything in just about any way, right? So it is possible to see X in any way at all. It's not saying much more than that. Now, what I find interesting, in fact, I think it's fascinating now to see some of the dialectical collisions. And what I mean by that is the tension inside these ideas. I'm going to step ahead of the text here, but if you look at the emphasis in this text, I said in the last reflection, perhaps the one before, I said, look out because management is coming our way, the concept of management. Now, I've been trying to suggest to you that management is about control. Management is about nailing things down. Management is about avoiding uncertainty. Management is often about a linear path from A to B, right? Management is about establishing processes that bring coordination and consistency and coherence to organizational and community life, right? So the notion of a CAS, one question you can ask yourself right off the bat, and you see the tension in this chapter. There's no doubt about it. Let me put it to you this way. After I read this chapter, I had the feeling that the idea of a CAS needs a strategic change plan of its own. If you read this chapter, CAS thinking is not the dominant motif, right? They talk in here about mental models, and they say to understand an SES, requires an understanding of mental models. So this is how they move into the topic of how individuals, people, human beings exist inside a CAS. They don't exist as automatic, self-organizing components of the system. They do not. In fact, they think. They carry these mental models in their heads. And many of the mental models associated with management, and here's my point about management, many of those mental models are running counter to the open interconnectedness, non-linearity, and complexity of a complex adaptive system. So the authors act as if we have management, this institution or this set of practices called management, and now we have this mental model of the CAS, and somehow we're going to combine them. But you need to see the tension there, right? Management is not about being open to uncertainty, embracing uncertainty, warming up to emergence, accepting unpredictability. That's not the world of management. by and large. So what you see here behind the scenes, so to speak, is a battle between the management paradigm and its relative contempt for uncertainty, for emergence, for anything that cannot be nailed down into a process of some kind. So there's that tension between management as a set of practices and the mental model of the CAS. And because that tension exists, I mentioned in the last reflection, they never talk about resistance. Because in human systems, if you're facing change, much less transformation, if you're just even incremental change, if you're in an organization, in a community, and you're advocating for change, you will meet resistance. There is no doubt about it. So the idea that a human system is a CAS with this kind of automatic inner ability to reorganize itself is not altogether clear in my view. That these models, that the model of a CAS and the standard model of management, and by the way, you can look that up, any management textbook, they'll go back to Weber and they'll say, what's management about? It's about organizing, coordinating. There are 8 or 9 or 10 standard criteria that serve to demarcate, if not define, what management is. All I'm trying to say here is do not be fooled. This chapter says, not in a triumphant and clear way, it says in a rather meek and quiet way, we need a change strategy for CAS thinking. So it's interesting to me that you have this model called the CAS, and it's a model intended to guide change through management. This is what is becoming clear here. And there's nothing wrong with any of this. I'm just trying to say there's a structure emerging in this text. And the structure is one of management, right? Through the CAS. But the problem is the CAS itself requires a change strategy. In other words, none of this will go forward until we convince management to adopt a new approach to management, right? Because this is what this is about. It's about using the CAS as a mental model to guide the, I hesitate to put it this way, but this is their language, to guide the production of ecosystem services. Now, on page 147, much of this chapter can be summarized just by looking at table 6.1. So this compares and contrasts the SCS as a CAS with the conventional view of ecosystems. Now, none of this should be a surprise to us. I'll read 2 examples. Individual elements can be treated in isolation. This is true of the conventional view. Well, the conventional view is the conventional management view, right? So this is my point. Management seeks to isolate, always, to classify, isolate, and describe. And there's nothing wrong with that. All I'm saying is that's management. System dynamics are linear and monotonic. That term, monotonicity, it's just interesting how they throw these terms in. Do you know what a monotonic curve is? Monotonic curve is a curve that just keeps rising. There are no dips. So it's never going like this. It's never dipping down as it goes up. It's a continuous ascent without any retrograde motion at all. So that's just by way of a note on the term. So classic views of ecosystems, the dominant management view, in other words, they see system dynamics as linear and monotonic. So they're just moving in one direction. They don't move backwards at all. Whereas in the case of the CAS, you have system dynamics, interconnectedness, you have uncertainties, even Knightian uncertainty, which is extreme uncertainty. It's when you can't even determine risk because you have no idea how to measure it, right? So that's one example. Actors are rational and have full information. This is on the management model, the conventional view. In the CAS version, actors have imperfect knowledge and are bounded. The rationality is bounded. That's an idea that comes, very useful idea, that comes from Herbert Simon, the notion of bounded rationality. In other words, you don't know everything you need to know, right? There are all sorts of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, all of that. I won't go into it. So page 147, you should take a look at that. Also, conventional views tend to be deterministic, right? I mentioned before deterministic models. Deterministic model is just a model in which you can predict future behavior by reference to past behavior. So there's kind of direct linearity between the two. So this is where they tip us off to the need for a change plan. It's just a little bit surprising that our guide to change itself requires a change plan. It's an interesting point, I think, about this chapter. Today, SES management increasingly, this is on 148, recognizes that one of the key challenges facing policymakers, scholars, and practitioners is to understand and anticipate the dynamic behavior of the CAS that result in wicked problems. Now, this notion of wicked problems, I'm sure you've seen before. Climate change would be an example of this. These problems are so complex. They're so riddled with uncertainties. The edges are so blurred. We're not even certain how to describe the problem, right? So when we discuss wicked problems, it's a bit of a, in my view, a peculiar term. Why? They're wicked problems. It's more than that. They're not just wicked. It's not just a very difficult problem. It's more than that. And I know I'm not being clear now. I'll give it some thought so I can provide some clarity on that. But I hate that term, wicked problems, because it makes it sound like, oh, another wicked problem. We can just put it there right next to the other wicked problem. I just think there's something peculiar about that. That's a personal opinion. Pay no attention. Now, they ask, how does CAS thinking enhance the resilience of ecosystem services? Let me get to the point here. It's not clear that they do. There's very, very limited evidence here. They do provide 3 examples. They're natural systems that are being managed under what would appear to be a CAS model or something approximating a CAS model. So now I also wanted to say, I want to make a historical note about the notion of a CAS. I believe, and I could be wrong here, and I'll research this and try to comment on it in future reflections, but I believe that the notion of a CAS is not new. The notion of a CAS evolves, so far as I know, out of ecology, right? It was ecology that brought into biological science and science as a whole the idea of systems that had a natural capacity to adapt, right? So again, most of the examples in this chapter are natural systems. These are systems with an intrinsic capability to adapt, right? So we've been studying those systems in their ecological settings for decades. So while this thinking may appear new with respect to the world of management, there's nothing new about this, in my opinion. The notion of a CAS, if you know your ecology, and I'm not an ecologist, but I understand the system's nature of ecology. That's, in fact, what's distinctive of ecology, is you move away from a focus on an organism or a class of organisms to the world surrounding the organisms and the interactions of the organisms with the environment and all of the feedbacks and the rest. That's not a new idea. It's an old idea out of ecology. So much of this is not that new. Now, I wanted to say on 149, I wanted to quote, these cases suggest that an alternative management style, see, that's where we're going, I believe. We're not really going to look at systems, complex adaptive systems. We're looking to manage them, right? And I wanted to read this. These cases suggest that an alternative management style, based on a worldview that recognizes CAS properties, may result in more resilient ecosystem services in the long term. May result. Now, I mentioned in, I think, the last reflection, there are far too many mays and cans in this book if we're going to regard it as a substantive piece of scientific thinking. That's how I would put it to you. I would say that to anyone. If a friend of mine were writing this book, I would say, why all the mays and the cans? Are you not able to make an assertion that can be defended clearly? Anyhow, I don't want to be too hard on them because, again, this is what is in its infancy is the entire approach to management, not to ecological systems. So I know maybe I'm beating a dead horse, but this book looked like a treatment of resilience in relation to CAS. But in fact, this book, if I understand its principal thesis, is about encouraging us to adopt this model, the CAS, to guide our management of ecosystem services. So I think all of this is quite important. And this chapter tends to underscore how feeble some of this is, right? Now, when I say feeble at the current moment, this is an active research program. So who knows where it will go? It might become the dominant management style in the next 30 to 40 years. Now, again, that takes us outside of the CAS into the human domain. Well, what do you mean? That we're going to adopt a new management style? Are we going to teach it at universities? Are we going to put it in MBA programs? Right? Like these are the practical questions one has to ask. Now, again, they talk a lot about the CAS thinking and its contributions to ecosystem service resilience. Now note how the property of resilience keeps shifting. Is it the ecosystem service that resiles, that demonstrates resilience? Or is it the SCS, or both? Is it the same kind of resilience? What's the relationship between the two? This is not yet clear to me. If it's clear to you, please bring it up in our Zoom sessions. Now, on 156, you can see it again. In many cases, it is too early to assess the extent to which CAS thinking is guiding management or catalyzing change. Indeed, it is too early, but it's not so early that we can't get a preliminary sense. And here's my preliminary sense. Having been an advocate of CAS, thinking about organizations for 25 years, having met with the resistance I have, I would say that it's not too early to assess. It's early enough. It's early. We can make the assessment now. This is one hell of an uphill climb. And if you don't think it is, I don't know what you're smoking, but it's a lot better than what I'm smoking. So I would just keep that in mind. There's a lot of tension in this text. It's really quite interesting. Now, I wanted to go to just a few other quotes that I thought might help us. Now, while CAS thinking, this is on 156 again, is itself may not compromise resilience, attempts to foster CAS thinking may compromise resilience in SES. It could compromise all sorts of things in the SES. It could start a riot in the SES. We need to see how different this approach is from standard management thinking. The CAS, if you're thinking in these terms, for example, you're a systems thinker by necessity, because it's included in the notion of CAS thinking. CAS thinking is systems thinking. Well, let's turn to the management world. Management isn't so concerned with systems, right? Management is more concerned with the components of systems and the structure of systems. So again, this is all by way of beating what by now is a dead horse, that this is moving to management, and that means you're moving into a collision, and it's in the culture of management itself. So I would keep that in mind. Now, managers may be motivated. This is again on 156, and this is where I noted in the text, CAS needs a change strategy. Now, in other words, the reason why it needs a change strategy is it's not the dominant management style by any means, not even close. So unless I'm wrong, and again, I'm just referring to my own experience, but I have not encountered many managers or leaders, very few, not more than one or two in my entire career, who would have resonated with any of this, right? So we need to see how far away from our reality this type of thinking is. Now, that's not to say that it's not very important. What it is to say is, if it is important, it has a long way to go, because it will meet a lot of established resistance in our customary approaches to management. So I would keep that in mind. In addition, a CAS approach often implies a change in a management paradigm from a focus on causality and control within short timeframes to a focus on coping with change and uncertainty over longer timescales. Correct. That's on 157. So it does. That's what I'm trying to say. It does imply a change in the management style or the management paradigm. And that's outside of any CAS. That's in the SES, if you want to see the SES as a CAS. I'm not at all certain I would see the SES as a CAS myself. I'm willing to see a plant as a CAS, but I'm not at all convinced, and you know why. I've been stating some of my reservations. Now, just to conclude, is this chapter, it's a fascinating chapter, but in essence, its argument can be summarized as: we need to advocate on behalf of the CAS as a mental model, a way of thinking, a way of looking at the world. We need to advocate this to the point where scientists, policymakers, managers pick it up and run with it, right? So you can see now that we've stepped right outside of this book. How? Well, this book is about the CAS, the SES, and how we can bring the CAS as a model of thinking into the SES so that we can properly guide the management of ecosystem services. All of that, I think, is part of this text. But in fact, we can't do any of this, right? We can't move forward with any of this until we challenge the dominant paradigm, right? Until we somehow break down the fortress walls of management with a capital M. Now, let me say one last thing about management with a capital M. Management with a capital M, and by the way, I have a cold. That's why I'm always going to, I've had a cold for a week. Anyhow, management with a capital M often comes, almost always comes, with something else called accountability with a capital A, right? So if you understand what accountability is, and I'm not all together convinced I understand, it's a very complex notion, but accountability is, this is one way of characterizing it, pretty shallow, but it's about counting every dime and nickel that you spend. So where is the money? What was it used for? And financial managers want to see a path from A to B. So you spend A and you spend it on B. And how much and when did you spend it? All of that detail becomes part of accountability, financial accountability. And if you work in public organizations, accountability hangs over you like a dark cloud at all times. So my point is, management is connected to accountability in this way, very kind of narrow notion of accountability, financial notion. Once you have that, it becomes very difficult even to discuss, for example, embracing uncertainty. Oh, no, look, Bob, all we have to do is embrace uncertainty and warm up to unpredictability. Now, when Bob hears that, Bob's going to look you in the eye and think that you've lost your mind, right? So I think these are reactions that we encounter in the real world, because in the real world, management is still the dominant paradigm, and management is about accountability. And accountability is refusing to accept uncertainties, unpredictabilities. It's about nailing things down, right? So things are not shifting, right? That's what management is about. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a complete necessity. We need to do it, but we need to understand how far away from this our current approaches to management are. So that's what I would say. If I were advising these authors, this is what I would tell them. Do you want this to, influence reality? Do you want this to be part of the change? Do you want this to work? Then you need a strategic change plan. Why? Because you need to take that dominant mental model in our heads, in the heads of most managers, and you need to replace it. And that is internal, deep change. That, my friends, is a form of transformation, right? So it's not clear. This, I think, is a capital point. This thing is not going to work, right? Unless they have something else behind it. And the something else behind it is a change strategy of its own, right? So that takes us to politics, to open conversations. So that's the point I wanted to make about this text. It's interesting too, just to close, that we're talking about managing something that's supposed to be self-organizing. Think about that. That's just a question to put in your heads. If a system is self-organizing, why am I managing it? Why do I have to manage it? Right? That's one question I would put out. The second question I would put out is this. They talk about epistemological pluralism. Epistemology is a theory of knowledge. So when they talk about epistemologies, they're talking about styles of knowing. And what they're saying is we should have more than one. So we welcome plurality. But that's not what they're saying. They say it. They say, oh, we support epistemological pluralism. They say that. But in fact, what they're trying to do is cultivate a uniform sense of CAS thinking across the population in question, managers, scientists, ecosystem managers, whatever. That entire phalanx of professionals, they're trying to influence them, right? And that makes perfect sense. It's just that that's a separate task, right? You have these principles, and then apart from those principles, you need a strategic change plan. And because it's so deep, the change required, you're talking about changing mental models, you're no longer in the world of incremental change. You're no longer in the world of typical change. You're in the world of transformation because you're changing how people see the world. And if you don't think people will resist that, as I said, you're smoking something that has more power than what I smoke. And I don't smoke anything. So I'm just saying, I'm not convinced that makes any sense. But anyhow, take a look. It's a fascinating text, if only because of these collisions, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes you can write a text that's clear from the first page to the last. And at other times, the ideas are so difficult, they're shifting so much that it's impossible to do that. And I think that's where these authors are. And I forgive them. I understand what they're trying to do because I've tried to do it myself. And that's why I'm saying to you now, if you think you can just walk into a management board and say, hey, everybody, we're going to do CAS thinking today, they'll show you the door, I guarantee you, very quickly. They're far more interested in things like accountability. Are we spending every dime in the way we said we would? It's a false concern at the end of the day, accountability. That's just a private opinion. We spend a lot of time measuring it and ensuring it. And when it really matters, we walk away from it as if it didn't matter at all. So anyhow, that might not make any sense in this context. So I'll let you go, and thanks for listening. Any questions, comments, let me know. Oh, by the way, I did put the reflections on YouTube. I'm going to send you the links. I don't think I did it the right way, but I think it will work. Okay, thanks. Take care.